Finding the forged will tucked behind our family photos was shocking enough, but watching my husband's face drain of color when he realized I'd already filed it with probate court was absolutely priceless. The three people he'd named as beneficiaries thought they were about to inherit everything I'd worked 15 years to build. They had no idea I'd been documenting their fraud for months, and that their greed was about to land them in federal prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Rodriguez, though everyone calls me Kate, and I've spent the last 18 years building one of Portland's most respected estate planning law firms. Starting with nothing but a public defender's salary and a mountain of student debt, I'd clawed my way to partnership in Rodriguez and Associates, specializing in complex probate cases and estate disputes. By 42, I had everything I thought I wanted: a thriving practice, a stunning home in the West Hills overlooking the Columbia River, and what I believed was a solid marriage to Marcus Brennan. Marcus and I met at a legal conference in Seattle 7 years ago. I was there presenting a seminar on estate tax planning, and he was attending as a commercial real estate developer, looking to understand the legal implications of inheritance property. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confidence that comes from closing million-dollar deals, Marcus had approached me after my presentation with what seemed like genuine interest in my expertise. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours over coffee that grew cold as we debated the intricacies of property law. What attracted me initially was his apparent respect for my intellect. Unlike other men I'd dated who seemed intimidated by my success, Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my work and listened carefully to my responses. He told me about his own business, developing luxury commercial properties throughout the Pacific Northwest, and how he'd built his company from a single small office building to a portfolio worth tens of millions. We seemed to complement each other perfectly, two driven professionals who understood the demands of building something meaningful. Our courtship unfolded over 6 months of long dinners discussing everything from zoning laws to our shared love of hiking the Oregon coast. Marcus was attentive without being overwhelming, successful without being boastful, and he seemed genuinely fascinated by the legal complexities of my cases. When he proposed on a weekend trip to Crater Lake, presenting a stunning vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother, I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was elegant but intimate, held at the historic Piddock Mansion with a view of Mount Hood, serving as our backdrop. Marcus's family attended, his mother Helen, a refined woman who'd raised 3 children after being widowed young, his sister Diana, a nurse practitioner who ran a successful clinic in Vancouver, and his younger brother Tyler, who worked in Marcus's business managing property acquisition. They welcomed me warmly, or so it seemed at the time. Helen told me how proud she was that Marcus had found someone who challenged him intellectually, and Diana mentioned how refreshing it was to have another strong woman in the family. The early years of our marriage felt like a partnership in the truest sense. Marcus would consult me on the legal aspects of his property deals, and I'd bounce complex estate cases off him during our evening walks through our neighborhood. We maintained separate offices but shared a vision for our future, expanding both our businesses, traveling when time permitted, and eventually starting a family. Marcus supported my decision to take on pro bono cases for elderly clients who couldn't afford quality estate planning, even when it meant working late nights and weekends. Our home became a reflection of our combined success and taste. The 1920s Tudor revival we'd purchased together needed extensive renovation, which Marcus oversaw with the same attention to detail he brought to his commercial project. We converted the 3rd floor into a home office for me, complete with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves for my legal volumes, and a view of the river that helped me think through complex cases. Marcus's study occupied the main floor, where he'd spread blueprints across an antique partner's desk and take calls with contractors and investors. The first subtle shift came about 3 years into our marriage, though I didn't recognize it as significant at the time. Marcus began mentioning his business partner more frequently. Vivian Chen was a marketing specialist who'd joined the company to help rebrand their properties for younger demographics. She was brilliant. Marcus explained, with an MBA from Stanford and innovative ideas about sustainable development that were attracting environmentally conscious tenants. Initially, I was pleased that Marcus had found someone who shared his vision for the company's growth. Vivian attended our annual holiday party that year, and I found her impressive in person. Poised and articulate, she spoke passionately about green building initiatives and the future of urban development. She was also strikingly beautiful, with long black hair and the kind of effortless elegance that made expensive clothes look even more sophisticated. Throughout the evening, I noticed how Marcus's attention seemed drawn to her, but I attributed it to their professional collaboration. They were working on several major projects together, and their enthusiasm was infectious. Gradually, Marcus's schedule became more demanding. Late meetings with investors stretched into dinner hours, weekend site visits required his immediate attention, and business trips to potential markets in Seattle and San Francisco became more frequent. When I'd suggest joining him on these trips, combining business with pleasure as we'd done in the past, Marcus would explain that the schedule was too packed, or that Vivian had already made arrangements that couldn't accommodate additional travelers. The distance wasn't just physical. Our evening conversations shifted from collaborative discussions about our respective work to Marcus providing brief summaries of his day before retreating to his study or claiming exhaustion. When I'd share details about particularly challenging cases, his responses became perfunctory, lacking the engaged curiosity that had characterized our early relationship. I told myself this was natural, that all marriages went through phases where work demands created temporary separation. My legal practice continued to flourish during this period, providing both distraction and satisfaction. I'd recently won a high-profile case involving a contested will where the deceased's second wife had attempted to disinherit his children from his first marriage. The case required extensive forensic accounting and document analysis, skills that had become my specialty. The victory not only secured my client's inheritance, but also garnered attention from other attorneys seeking my expertise in similar disputes. It was this professional success that led to an opportunity that would unknowingly save my future. David Kim, a fellow attorney who'd become both colleague and friend over the years, approached me about forming a partnership. His expertise in business law complemented my estate planning background, and together we could offer clients comprehensive legal services. The partnership would require restructuring our practices and significant financial investment, but the potential for growth was substantial. When I discussed the opportunity with Marcus over dinner one evening, his reaction surprised me. Rather than the enthusiasm and support I'd expected, he seemed distant and distracted. He asked few questions about the business plan or financial projections, instead suggesting that I might be taking on too much responsibility. Perhaps, he suggested, I should consider scaling back rather than expanding. The comment stung, particularly coming from someone who'd always encouraged my ambition. I moved forward with the partnership anyway, using my own savings and a business loan to finance my portion of the investment. The legal work required to establish Rodriguez and Kim Associates was extensive, involving contracts, insurance policies, and detailed agreements about profit sharing and decision-making. As an estate planning attorney, I was meticulous about documentation, ensuring every aspect of our professional relationship was clearly defined and legally protected. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was creating ironclad legal agreements with my business partner, the legal foundation of my marriage was something I'd never questioned. Marcus and I had never signed a prenuptial agreement, both of us entering the marriage with established careers and assets. Oregon's community property laws seemed sufficient protection for our interests, and frankly the idea of planning for our marriage's potential dissolution felt contrary to the commitment we were making. This oversight would prove more significant than I could have imagined. During the months I spent establishing the new law firm, working late nights to transition clients and finalize partnerships, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd leave early for meetings he couldn't clearly explain, receive phone calls he'd take in another room, and display an irritability that seemed disproportionate to whatever business pressures he claimed to be facing. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March when I returned home from a particularly challenging day, negotiating partnership terms with David. I'd been looking forward to sharing the good news that we'd successfully secured our largest client to date, a wealthy family requiring comprehensive estate planning for multiple generations. Instead, I found Marcus in his study with papers spread across his desk, quickly gathering them into folders when I entered. His explanation was vague, something about restructuring the business to accommodate new investors, but his body language suggested something more serious. When I offered to review the documents, knowing that real estate law intersected with my estate planning expertise, Marcus declined with an abruptness that felt almost hostile. For the first time in our marriage, I had the distinct impression that my husband was hiding something significant from me. That night, lying awake while Marcus slept beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. As an attorney, I'd learned to trust my instincts about when situations didn't feel right. Every successful case I'd handled began with recognizing inconsistencies and following evidence wherever it led. If Marcus was involved in something that could affect our marriage or our finances, I needed to understand what it was. The next morning, I began paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Marcus's credit card statements, which arrived in our shared home office, showed charges at expensive restaurants during times he'd claimed to be working late alone. His travel receipts included hotel accommodations for two when he'd supposedly been traveling solo for business. Phone records revealed frequent calls to numbers I didn't recognize, often late at night or early in the morning. As an estate planning attorney, I understood the importance of financial transparency in marriage. I'd counseled numerous clients about protecting their interests when spouses exhibited secretive behavior about money or assets. The advice I'd given others now seemed relevant to my own situation: document everything, verify claims independently, and prepare for the possibility that the person you trust most might not be trustworthy. This realization was heartbreaking, but not paralyzing. Instead, it activated the same methodical approach I brought to complex legal cases. If Marcus was hiding something, I would discover what it was. If our marriage was in jeopardy, I would protect my interest. And if my instincts were correct about his deception, I would ensure that any attempt to take advantage of my trust would backfire spectacularly. Looking back, this was the moment when I stopped being a naive wife and started being the attorney I'd trained to be. The woman who'd built a successful practice by outmaneuvering opponents who underestimated her was about to apply those same skills to the most personal case of her career. Marcus had no idea that his secretive behavior had awakened not hurt feelings, but professional instincts honed by years of exposing deception and protecting clients from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The game had begun, though only one of us knew we were playing. The investigation began with the systematic approach I'd perfected over years of handling contested estates. Every morning, after Marcus left for what he claimed were early meetings with contractors, I would spend an hour methodically photographing documents in his study. Bank statements, business correspondence, property deeds, and investment portfolios all received my careful attention. What I discovered painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than simple marital infidelity. Marcus's business empire, which I'd always assumed was thriving, was actually teetering on the edge of collapse. 3 major development projects had stalled due to environmental challenges and zoning disputes, leaving him with massive construction loans and no income to service them. The elegant confidence he projected was masking a financial crisis that threatened everything we'd built together. But more troubling than the business problems was the pattern of deception I uncovered in how he was attempting to solve them. The first major red flag appeared in a series of emails between Marcus and Vivian Chen that went far beyond professional collaboration. Their communication revealed not just an affair but a calculated scheme to restructure his assets in ways that would protect them from creditors, while leaving me financially exposed. Vivian wasn't simply his marketing partner, she was a sophisticated financial planner with a background in forensic accounting, who understood exactly how to hide money from both business creditors and a spouse in divorce proceedings. Their correspondence used coded language that anyone else might have dismissed as business jargon, but my legal training recognized it immediately as fraud planning. References to restructuring ownership percentages and optimizing beneficiary designations were actually discussions about transferring assets to shell companies and offshore accounts. They spoke about timeline acceleration, and documentation preparation with the clinical detachment of people planning a heist. The scope of their deception became clear when I discovered a folder labeled Estate Planning Updates, hidden behind other files in Marcus's desk. Inside were draft documents that made my blood run cold: professional quality wills, trusts and beneficiary designations that had been created without my knowledge or involvement. The signature on these documents looked remarkably like mine, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed anything resembling these papers. The forged will was a masterpiece of deception, formatted exactly like the documents I created for my own clients, but with content that would have made me laugh if it weren't so malicious. According to this fabricated testament, I had decided to leave the bulk of my estate to Marcus's family as a gesture of appreciation for welcoming me into their lives. Diana would inherit my share of the law firm, Tyler would receive our house, and Vivian would get my personal investment portfolio. The document even included a touching paragraph about how these people had shown me the true meaning of family loyalty, but the will was just the beginning. Marcus and Vivian had created an entire parallel legal universe, where my death would trigger a series of financial transfers that would essentially erase my existence while enriching his family and mistress. Life insurance policies had been modified to name new beneficiaries, retirement accounts had been restructured with different inheritance designations, and even my car title had been altered to reflect joint ownership that I'd never agreed to. The technical quality of the forgeries was impressive, suggesting that Vivian's skills extended well beyond marketing and financial planning. She had somehow obtained official letterhead from my law firm, created documents with watermarks and security features that matched legitimate legal papers, and even forged notary stamps that would pass casual inspection. This wasn't amateur hour, this was professional-grade fraud that had obviously taken months to orchestrate. As I photographed each document, my initial shock gave way to the cold analytical thinking that made me effective in court. These people had made a critical error by underestimating my expertise in exactly the type of law they were attempting to manipulate. Estate planning and probate fraud were not just my profession, they were my specialty. I had spent years learning to recognize forged documents, trace hidden assets, and expose beneficiary manipulation schemes. They had chosen to commit fraud against perhaps the one person in Portland best equipped to detect and prosecute their crime. The timeline of their scheme became apparent as I worked backward through the documentation. Planning had begun almost 18 months earlier, shortly after I'd announced my partnership with David Kim. The formation of Rodriguez and Kim Associates had apparently triggered concerns that my increased business success would make me more financially independent and harder to manipulate. Rather than celebrating my professional growth, Marcus had seen it as a threat to his ability to control our shared assets. The timing coincided with other changes I'd attributed to normal business pressure. Marcus's increased travel schedule allowed him extended time with Vivian to plan their strategy. His sudden interest in updating our wills and insurance policies, which he'd claimed was prompted by responsible financial planning, was actually reconnaissance, understand our existing legal protection. Even his suggestion that I might be taking on too much responsibility with the new partnership now revealed itself as an attempt to discourage the professional growth that threatened their scheme. The depth of the betrayal was staggering, but what struck me most was the casual cruelty evident in their communication. They discussed my theoretical death with the detached pragmatism of people planning a vacation, debating whether certain asset transfers would trigger tax implications or investigation by authority. Vivian had even researched the average timeline for probate proceedings in Oregon, calculating how quickly she could access funds after my demise. The most chilling discovery was a printed email where Marcus expressed concern about the timeline of their plan. He worried that I might discover their activities before the documents could be properly executed, potentially requiring them to accelerate their strategy. Vivian's response was coldly practical. She suggested that certain life insurance policies could be triggered by accidents that wouldn't necessarily require long-term planning. The implication was unmistakable. They weren't just planning to steal my assets after a natural death, they were considering more active measures to accelerate that timeline. This revelation transformed my investigation from a personal betrayal into a potential matter of life and death. I realized that my marriage hadn't just been failing, it had become dangerous. The people I trusted most were not only planning to rob me, they were potentially planning to kill me to accomplish it. The comfortable life I'd built was actually an elaborate trap, and I was the prey who'd been too trusting to recognize the predators circling around me. My legal training kicked into overdrive as I began documenting everything with the thoroughness I'd use in a major court case. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every forged document was photographed from multiple angles. Every suspicious email was forwarded to a secure account Marcus couldn't access, and every piece of evidence was stored in multiple locations, both physical and digital. I created detailed timelines of their communications, traced financial transactions through multiple accounts, and began building a comprehensive case that would hold up under the scrutiny of both civil and criminal courts. The challenge was maintaining normal behavior while conducting this investigation. Marcus was already suspicious of my late nights at the office, which he attributed to stress from the new partnership. I couldn't afford to raise additional concerns by dramatically changing my routine or asking questions that might alert him to my discoveries. Instead, I used my legitimate work responsibilities as cover for the additional research I was conducting into their activities. My partnership with David Kim proved invaluable during this period, though he had no idea how personally relevant our professional collaboration was becoming. As we worked together on legitimate estate planning cases, I was able to ask hypothetical questions about asset protection, beneficiary fraud, and probate challenges that helped me understand the legal vulnerabilities in Marcus and Vivian's scheme. David's expertise in business law also provided insights into the corporate structures they were using to hide assets from creditors. The investigation revealed that Marcus's financial problems were even worse than the documentation suggested. He wasn't just facing business difficulties, he was involved in several questionable deals that bordered on securities fraud. Some of his recent property investments had been funded with money that appeared to belong to other investors, creating a Ponzi-like structure where new investment was being used to pay returns to earlier investors. If these schemes collapsed, Marcus wouldn't just face bankruptcy, he would likely face federal criminal charges. Understanding the desperation behind their actions helped explain the extremity of their plan. Marcus wasn't just trying to preserve his lifestyle or avoid embarrassment. He was trying to avoid federal prison. My death would not only provide them with immediate access to significant assets, it would also eliminate the one person most likely to discover and report his financial crime. I represented both the solution to their money problems and the greatest threat to their freedom. The personal betrayal was devastating, but the professional challenge was energizing. I'd spent my career protecting clients from exactly these types of schemes, and now I had the opportunity to use those skills to protect myself. More importantly, I had the chance to expose criminals who had made the mistake of targeting someone uniquely qualified to destroy them. They had chosen the wrong victim, and their underestimation of my capabilities would prove to be their downfall. As I continued gathering evidence, I began formulating a strategy that would not only protect me from their scheme, but ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their crime. The forged will they'd created would become the centerpiece of their prosecution. But I needed to make sure they actually attempted to use it before I revealed my knowledge of their activities. Like any good attorney, I understood that the strongest cases were built by allowing criminals to commit their crimes completely before exposing them. The waiting period was the most difficult part of the entire ordeal. Every day brought new evidence of their deception, but I had to maintain the facade of an unsuspecting wife while they continued planning what they believed would be my destruction. Marcus would kiss me goodbye each morning before leaving to meet with the people plotting against me, and I would smile and tell him to have a good day while mentally cataloging his lie. The psychological toll was significant, but it was offset by the growing excitement of building an airtight case against people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I'd seen this pattern in many of my professional cases. Criminals who became so confident in their schemes that they stopped being careful about evidence. Marcus and Vivian's arrogance was creating a paper trail that would make prosecution almost effortless. The final piece of their puzzle became apparent when I discovered correspondence about a weekend trip to our cabin in Bend. Marcus had suggested the getaway as a chance to reconnect and plan our future together, but the emails between him and Vivian revealed it as something far more sinister. The remote location, the timing that coincided with a period when David would be out of state and unable to immediately notice my absence, and the life insurance policies that would pay double for accidental death all pointed to a weekend that I might not be intended to survive. This discovery marked the end of my passive investigation and the beginning of active preparation for what would become the most important case of my career. The case that would determine whether I lived or died, whether justice would prevail or criminals would profit from their betrayal. The scared wife who had first discovered suspicious credit card charges was gone, replaced by an attorney who understood exactly how to turn her opponent's weapons against them. The game was about to change, though Marcus and Vivian had no idea that their carefully planned endgame was actually the beginning of their complete destruction. The cabin in Bend had been our retreat for 3 years, a place where we'd spent long weekends hiking the Cascade Trails and planning our future together. Now, as I prepared for what Marcus intended to be my final weekend, that same cabin would become the stage for the most elaborate legal trap I'd ever constructed. If they wanted to use my supposed death to trigger their fraudulent inheritance scheme, I would give them exactly what they were asking for, just not in the way they expect. My preparation began with creating an impeccable paper trail that would expose their crimes while protecting my actual asset. Working late nights in my home office while Marcus believed I was catching up on case files, I systematically restructured my estate planning in ways that would make their forged documents not just useless, but actively incriminate. Every legitimate legal change I made was designed to contradict their fabricated will, creating irrefutable evidence that their documents were fraudulent. The first step was establishing a revocable living trust that would immediately transfer all my major assets out of probate jurisdiction. Unlike the simple will they had forged, which would require public probate proceedings they could manipulate, a properly funded trust would transfer assets privately and immediately upon my death. The trust documents were prepared with David's assistance, though I told him I was simply updating my estate planning to reflect our new partnership. He praised my thoroughness in protecting my interests, having no idea how literally true that statement was. Within the trust structure, I named beneficiaries that would horrify Marcus and his conspirators. My law firm shares would transfer to David Kim with specific instructions that he investigate any suspicious circumstances surrounding my death. My personal investment accounts would fund a charitable foundation dedicated to prosecuting estate fraud, with the ironic name of the Marcus Brennan Institute for Legal Justice. The house they thought Tyler would inherit was instead bequeathed to a legal aid organization specializing in domestic violence cases. But the trust was just the beginning of my legal maneuvering. I also created a comprehensive forensic audit trail that would automatically trigger upon my death, designed to expose every aspect of their financial crime. Working with a private investigator I'd used on previous cases, I established a system where any attempt to file the forged will would immediately notify law enforcement agencies about the extensive fraud documentation I'd compiled. They thought my death would silence the only witness to their crimes, but I was actually turning my death into the trigger that would destroy them. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Tom Reeves, who specialized in white-collar crime, was initially skeptical of my claims until I showed him the evidence I'd gathered. His professional admiration for the quality of documentation I'd assembled was gratifying, but his concern for my safety was sobering. He strongly recommended that I immediately confront Marcus or seek police protection, but I convinced him that allowing the criminals to attempt their scheme was the only way to ensure they faced appropriate consequences. Tom agreed to help under specific conditions. He would monitor the cabin remotely during our weekend trip, maintain constant communication with me through encrypted devices, and have emergency response teams positioned nearby. More importantly, he would ensure that every aspect of their attempted fraud was documented with admissible evidence that would hold up in both civil and criminal court. If they were planning to harm me, they would instead find themselves walking into a comprehensive law enforcement operation. The psychological preparation was more challenging than the legal logistics. Maintaining normal behavior while living with someone planning your murder required a level of emotional control that years of courtroom experience had taught me. But nothing could have prepared me for the surreal experience of planning dinner menus with a man who was calculating life insurance payout. Marcus's casual affection felt like the caresses of a snake, and his concerned questions about my work stress seemed like a predator evaluating the readiness of prey. The most disturbing aspect was how normal everything appeared on the surface. Marcus continued bringing me coffee in the morning, asking about my cases over dinner, and expressing what seemed like genuine interest in my work with David on the new partnership. If I hadn't seen the evidence of his deception, I would have had no reason to suspect that the man sharing my bed was planning my death. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, requiring constant mental effort to separate the loving husband I'd believed in from the criminal mastermind I now knew him to be. Vivian's presence became more obvious during this period, though she maintained the pretense of professional collaboration. She would call during dinner hours with supposed urgent questions about property marketing, and Marcus would retreat to his study for conversations that lasted well over an hour. When I'd casually ask about these calls, Marcus would provide vague explanations about challenging clients or complex zoning issues that required immediate attention. The three conspirators had also begun meeting more frequently at Marcus's office. Sessions they claimed were focused on restructuring the business to attract new investors. Diana would drive down from Vancouver for these meetings, and Tyler would adjust his schedule to accommodate what they described as strategic planning sessions. The family unity that had once seemed genuine now revealed itself as a criminal conspiracy, where my in-laws were actively participating in plans for my destruction. Understanding the family dynamics behind their betrayal provided crucial insights into their motivations and methods. Helen, Marcus's mother, had apparently been struggling financially since her husband's death, relying increasingly on assistance from her children. Diana's clinic was facing competition from larger medical practices, and Tyler's income depended entirely on his position in Marcus's failing business. My death wouldn't just benefit them financially, it would solve multiple family problems simultaneously. The forged will they'd created wasn't just about greed, it was about families' survival in their mind. They had convinced themselves that I was an outsider who had temporarily benefited from association with their family, and that my assets rightfully belonged to people who shared Marcus's bloodline. The rationalization was both pathetic and infuriating, but understanding their mindset helped me anticipate their actions and prepare appropriate countermeasures. My counter-strategy expanded beyond simply protecting my assets to ensuring that each conspirator faced consequences specifically tailored to their individual crime. Diana would lose her medical license when her participation in forging legal documents came to light, ending her ability to practice nursing. Tyler would face embezzlement charges for his role in hiding business assets, making him unemployable in any position requiring financial responsibility. Helen would discover that her son's criminal conviction would make her ineligible for the senior living community she'd planned to move to, forcing her to confront the consequences of her family's choices. But Vivian represented the greatest challenge and the most satisfying target for justice. Her sophisticated knowledge of financial fraud and document forgery suggested a criminal history that deserved investigation by federal authorities. I suspected that Marcus wasn't her first victim, and that exposing her would protect other potential targets from similar schemes. Through Tom Reeves, I arranged for her background to receive scrutiny from agencies that specialized in financial crimes and identity theft. The weekend trip to Bend was scheduled for the first weekend in June, chosen because David would be attending a legal conference in San Francisco and wouldn't immediately notice my absence. Marcus had been unusually attentive in the weeks leading up to the trip, suggesting romantic dinners and planning activities that seemed designed to create positive final memories. The irony was heartbreaking. He was trying to be a good husband during the final days before murdering me. My preparation for the weekend involved creating multiple layers of protection and evidence gathering that would turn their murder attempt into a comprehensive law enforcement sting operation. Tom Reeves arranged for surveillance equipment to be installed throughout the cabin, including devices that would record audio and video of any incriminating conversations or action. Emergency response teams would be positioned within minutes of the cabin, ready to intervene if the situation became immediately dangerous. The legal documentation was prepared with the same attention to detail I brought to my most complex cases. Sealed affidavits describing their fraud scheme were filed with multiple courts, timed to be opened automatically if I failed to check in by specified deadline. Copies of all evidence were distributed to law enforcement agencies, my business partner and legal colleagues, who would ensure appropriate follow-up regardless of what happened to me. But the most elegant aspect of my preparation was the trap I'd built around their forged will itself. Instead of simply exposing it as fraudulent, I had created a situation where their attempt to file it would trigger immediate criminal charges for probate fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. They thought the will was their pathway to my assets, but it was actually a legal landmine that would explode the moment they tried to use it. The psychological preparation involved accepting the possibility that despite all my precautions, Marcus might actually succeed in harming me. Writing letters to be delivered after my death was emotionally devastating, but necessary to ensure that my voice would continue advocating for justice even if I wasn't alive to see it. I recorded detailed video testimony describing their crimes, created comprehensive documentation of their motives and methods, and established a legal foundation that would make their prosecution inevitable regardless of my survival. The most difficult aspect was maintaining hope while preparing for the worst possible outcome. Years of legal practice had taught me to plan for every contingency, but nothing in my professional experience had involved planning for my own potential murder. The emotional toll was exhausting, requiring constant vigilance to prevent my growing knowledge from affecting my behavior in ways that might alert Marcus to my awareness of his plans. As the weekend approached, Marcus's behavior became increasingly solicitous and romantic. He planned elaborate meals at the cabin, arranged for champagne and flowers to be delivered, and spoke repeatedly about how much he was looking forward to our time alone together. The cruel irony of his romantic gestures made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to respond with appropriate enthusiasm while mentally rehearsing the evidence that would destroy him. The final weeks before our trip were spent in a bizarre state of suspended reality. During the day, I would handle legitimate legal cases while secretly preparing for what might be my own death. Evenings were spent with a husband who appeared loving and attentive while actually planning my murder. The psychological compartmentalization required to function in this environment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, but my legal training in managing complex, high-stakes situations proved invaluable. Tom Reeves conducted final equipment checks and reviewed emergency protocols until every detail was perfectly planned. Law enforcement agencies were briefed on the situation and prepared to respond immediately to any evidence of criminal activity. The forensic accountants who would trace their hidden assets were standing by to begin work the moment their fraud attempt was initiated. The night before our departure, as I lay in bed next to Marcus listening to his peaceful breathing, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The successful attorney who had built a thriving practice through hard work and integrity was about to face the ultimate test of those same skills. Tomorrow would determine whether justice would triumph over betrayal, whether intelligence could overcome treachery, and whether a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting others could successfully protect herself. The scared wife who had first noticed suspicious credit card charges was gone, replaced by a legal strategist who had spent months building an unassailable case against people foolish enough to commit crimes against someone uniquely qualified to expose them. Marcus and his conspirators thought they were taking their victim to a remote location where they could act without witnesses or interference. Instead, they were walking into the most sophisticated legal trap ever constructed, carrying their own evidence of guilt and heading toward their complete destruction. The game they thought they were winning was actually over before it began, though they wouldn't realize it until the moment their victory turned into their doom. The drive to Bend unfolded like a macabre theater performance, with Marcus playing the role of devoted husband, while I maintained the facade of unsuspecting wife. He had packed our favorite hiking gear, selected a playlist of songs from our early dating days, and stopped at the roadside fruit stand where we'd bought fresh berries on previous trip. Every gesture was calculated to create the illusion of a romantic getaway, but knowing his true intentions transformed each loving touch into evidence of his sociopathic manipulation. The 3-hour journey through the Columbia River Gorge provided ample opportunity for Marcus to establish his alibi through seemingly casual conversation. He mentioned calling his mother to let her know we'd arrived safely, texted Tyler about checking on a construction site Monday morning, and made a point of discussing our dinner reservations at a restaurant in downtown Bend. Each communication created a digital trail showing his expectation that we would both be returning home, carefully constructing the narrative of a tragic accident that would devastate him as much as anyone else. My own performance required equal precision, responding to his romantic overtures with convincing enthusiasm while mentally cataloging every detail that would later serve as evidence of premeditation. The encrypted phone Tom Reeves had provided was hidden in my hiking pack, maintaining constant communication with the surveillance team positioned throughout the area. Every mile of our journey was being monitored by professionals who understood that they were watching a potential murder victim being driven to her execution. The cabin sat nestled among towering ponderosa pines on the shores of Elk Lake, with the snow-capped peaks of the Three Sisters Mountains reflecting in the pristine water. We'd purchased the property during our second year of marriage, drawn by its isolation and natural beauty. The irony wasn't lost on me that the place we'd chosen for its romantic seclusion was now selected by Marcus for its lack of witnesses. The very qualities that had made it perfect for intimate getaways also made it ideal for committing murder without detection. Marcus's behavior during our first evening revealed the careful choreography of his plan. He prepared an elaborate dinner featuring my favorite dishes, opened an expensive bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion, and maintained constant conversation about our future together. His performance was so convincing that if I hadn't known about his deception, I would have been touched by his apparent effort to reconnect with our marriage. Instead, every gesture felt like a condemned prisoner's last meal prepared by the executioner with false compassion. The surveillance equipment Tom had installed was invisible to casual observation, but comprehensive in its coverage. Cameras captured every angle of the cabin's interior and exterior, while audio devices recorded conversations with crystal clarity. Motion sensors monitored the surrounding forest, and emergency beacons would summon immediate response if activated. Marcus had chosen this location for its isolation, but unknown to him, it was actually under more intensive observation than a federal courthouse. After dinner, Marcus suggested we review the financial planning documents he'd brought along, presenting them as an opportunity to update our wills and insurance policies, while we had uninterrupted time to focus on important decisions. The folder he opened contained the forged documents I'd already photographed, but seeing them presented as legitimate paperwork in the romantic candlelight of our cabin dining room was surreal beyond description. He was literally asking me to sign my own death warrant, while pretending it was an act of loving responsibility. His explanation of the documents was masterfully deceptive, highlighting provisions that appeared to benefit me while concealing the clauses that would transfer my assets to his family and mistress. He pointed out increased life insurance coverage, emphasizing how it would protect me financially if anything happened to him, while failing to mention that the beneficiary designations had been altered to exclude me entirely. His tone was patient and caring, as if he were helping me understand complex legal concepts rather than manipulating me into signing fraudulent papers. My response required Academy Award-level acting, asking questions that demonstrated appropriate concern while avoiding any indication that I recognized the documents as forgeries. I expressed gratitude for his thoughtfulness in organizing our financial planning, praised his attention to detail, and agreed that updating our paperwork was long overdue. Meanwhile, every word of his deceptive presentation was being recorded for later use in his criminal prosecution. The most challenging moment came when Marcus actually presented the forged will for my signature, complete with fake notarization he'd arranged through Vivian's connections. The document was beautifully prepared, with official letterhead and legal language that would have convinced most people of its authenticity, but my trained eye immediately spotted the subtle errors that marked it as fraudulent, from incorrect statutory references to formatting inconsistencies that revealed its true origin. Rather than signing immediately, I suggested we review everything one more time in the morning when we were both fresh and alert. This delay clearly frustrated Marcus, who had obviously planned for the documents to be completed that evening, but he couldn't object without revealing the urgency behind his request. Instead, he agreed with apparent understanding, suggesting that such important decisions deserved careful consideration. The night that followed was the most terrifying of my life, lying in bed next to a man I now knew was capable of murder while pretending to sleep peacefully. Every sound outside the cabin, every shift in Marcus's breathing, every creak of the building settling made me wonder if this was the moment he would act. The encrypted phone provided some comfort, knowing that any disturbance would immediately alert the response team, but the psychological toll of waiting for attempted murder was almost unbearable. Marcus's sleep appeared genuine, but I remained awake throughout the night, mentally rehearsing the responses I would need for whatever scenario might unfold the next day. If he attempted immediate violence, I would activate the emergency beacon and flee to predetermined safe positions in the surrounding forest. If he continued with psychological manipulation, I would maintain my performance while gathering additional evidence of his deception. Morning brought a false sense of normalcy as Marcus prepared breakfast and discussed our planned hiking route with apparent enthusiasm. He had chosen a trail that led to a remote overlook above the lake, accessible only through narrow mountain paths where accidents could easily occur. The hike would take us far from cellular coverage and potential witnesses, providing the perfect opportunity for a tragic fall that would appear completely accidental to investigating authority. My hiking preparation included equipment Marcus didn't know about, from the GPS beacon sewn into my jacket, to the emergency supplies hidden in supposedly innocent locations throughout my path. Tom Reeves had provided gear that would allow me to survive and call for help even if Marcus succeeded in leaving me stranded in the wilderness. The irony was perfect. Marcus thought he was leading me to my death, but I was actually leading him into a comprehensive law enforcement operation. The trail began gently winding through dense forest that provided excellent cover for the surveillance team following our progress. Marcus maintained cheerful conversation about the beauty of the landscape and our shared memories of previous hikes, all while guiding us toward the isolated overlook where he planned to stage my accident. His performance was flawless, showing no indication of the violence he was contemplating beyond occasional glances at his watch that suggested he was operating on a specific timeline. The overlook itself was breathtakingly beautiful, offering panoramic views of the Cascade Mountains and the pristine wilderness stretching to the horizon. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect spot for romantic reflection and future planning. Instead, I found myself calculating escape routes and defensive positions while Marcus positioned himself between me and the safest path back down the mountain. His transition from loving husband to potential murderer was so gradual that it might have been imperceptible to someone not specifically watching for it. The change began with subtle alterations in his body language, a tensing of muscles and shifting of weight that suggested preparation for physical action. His conversation became more forced, with longer pauses and less natural responses that indicated his mind was focused on something other than casual hiking discussion. The moment of truth arrived when Marcus suggested we approach the edge of the overlook for better photographs, positioning himself so that a single push would send me tumbling down the rocky cliff face to certain death hundreds of feet below. His hands moved to my shoulders in what would appear to any observer as an affectionate gesture, but I could feel the tension in his grip that preceded violence. Instead of the helpless victim he expected, Marcus found himself face to face with a woman who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. My response was swift and decisive, stepping away from the cliff edge while simultaneously activating the emergency beacon that would summon immediate assistance. The look of confusion and growing alarm on his face was immensely satisfying as he realized that his carefully planned murder was not proceeding according to script. The words I spoke next had been rehearsed countless times during the sleepless nights leading up to this confrontation, chosen for their legal precision and emotional impact. I informed Marcus that I had known about his affair with Vivian for months, that I had copies of all their correspondence planning my murder, and that his attempted filing of forged documents would result in federal criminal charges. The transformation in his expression from confusion to shock to panic was fascinating to observe in someone who had believed himself to be in complete control. His immediate response was to deny everything, claiming that I was misunderstanding innocent business communications and standard estate planning procedure. But when I began reciting specific details from their emails, including Vivian's calculations about life insurance payouts and their discussions about accelerating the timeline for my death, his denials became increasingly desperate and contradictory. The sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions provided the perfect dramatic backdrop for revealing the full scope of the law enforcement operation he had unknowingly walked into. Federal agents, state police, and county sheriffs were converging on our location with evidence teams prepared to document every aspect of his attempted murder. The isolated overlook he had chosen for its lack of witnesses was actually under observation by more law enforcement personnel than most major crime scenes. Marcus's panic escalated to complete desperation as he realized the magnitude of his situation. His attempts at physical intimidation were pathetic given the approaching cavalry, but his psychological manipulation became more frantic as he tried to convince me that cooperation would benefit us both. He promised to abandon his relationship with Vivian, claimed that the forged documents were her idea, and suggested that we could work together to avoid the legal consequences of their scheme. But my response was the product of months of planning and years of legal experience dealing with criminals who underestimated their victims. I had no interest in negotiation or cooperation with someone who had planned my murder regardless of his current desperation. The evidence I had compiled would ensure his conviction on multiple federal charges, and the comprehensive nature of my preparation meant that no aspect of his crimes would escape prosecution. The arrival of the first law enforcement team marked the end of Marcus's freedom and the beginning of a legal process that would expose every detail of the conspiracy he had orchestrated. As federal agents approached our position, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction knowing that the man who had planned to push me off this cliff was instead being arrested for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The irony was perfect in its just. Marcus had brought me to this remote location believing he would eliminate the only witness to his crimes, but instead he had provided law enforcement with video evidence of attempted murder while walking directly into a trap that would ensure his complete destruction. The loving husband who had prepared romantic dinners while planning my death was about to discover that his victim was actually the architect of his downfall. The game he thought he was winning had been over before it began, and the moment of his intended victory had become the catalyst for his total defeat. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland had never felt more like home than it did the morning Marcus, Vivian, Diana, Tyler, and Helen were led into the building in handcuffs. 6 months had passed since that confrontation on the mountain overlook, and the legal machinery I had set in motion was finally delivering the justice they all deserved. As the lead witness in their prosecution, I sat in the gallery watching 5 people who had planned my murder face the consequences of their spectacular miscalculation. The media attention had been intense from the moment news broke about the elaborate murder conspiracy involving a prominent Portland real estate developer and his attorney wife. The story had everything journalists loved: wealth, betrayal, sophisticated fraud, and a victim who had outmaneuvered her would-be killers through superior legal strategy. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters eager to capture footage of what had become known locally as the forged will murder plot. Marcus had aged dramatically during his months in federal custody, the confident swagger of wealth and privilege replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone facing life in prison. His expensive suits had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit that made him look like exactly what he was: a common criminal who had made the fatal error of targeting someone smarter than himself. The transformation was so complete that I almost felt sorry for him, until I remembered the cold calculation with which he had planned my death. Vivian's arrest had revealed a criminal history far more extensive than even I had suspected. The FBI's investigation uncovered evidence that she had been running similar inheritance fraud schemes across multiple states, targeting wealthy individuals in failing marriages and manipulating their spouses into elaborate murder plots. I wasn't her first intended victim, just the first one intelligent enough to recognize her methods and competent enough to destroy her operation. 3 other cases in California, Nevada, and Arizona were being reopened based on evidence discovered in her Portland activity. The prosecution of Diana proved particularly satisfying, as her nursing license had been immediately suspended pending criminal proceeding. The medical board's investigation revealed that she had been using her healthcare access to obtain detailed information about wealthy patients' family dynamics and financial situations, essentially scouting potential targets for Vivian's scheme. Her clinic had closed permanently when other nurses discovered the extent of her criminal activities, leaving her unemployed and unemployable in any healthcare capacity. Tyler's role in hiding business assets had triggered a comprehensive audit of Marcus's entire real estate empire, uncovering fraud that extended back nearly a decade. The Internal Revenue Service had seized properties worth millions of dollars, and civil lawsuits from defrauded investors were proceeding simultaneously with the criminal prosecution. His dreams of inheriting my house had been replaced by the reality of sharing a federal prison cell with his brother. Helen's prosecution had been the most emotionally complex for me, as she was the one family member who had shown me genuine warmth during our early relationship. But the evidence revealed that she had been the mastermind behind the inheritance aspects of their scheme, using her knowledge of estate planning gained from her late husband's business to identify vulnerabilities in my financial structure. Her age would likely result in a lighter sentence, but the conviction would end any possibility of the comfortable retirement she had been counting on. The trial itself was a masterclass in how thorough preparation could turn a complex criminal conspiracy into an open and shut case. Every email, every forged document, every financial transaction, and every surveillance recording was presented with the methodical precision that had made my legal career successful. The defense attorneys, despite their considerable skill and experience, had no effective response to the overwhelming evidence their clients had created through their own communications and action. The moment that provided the greatest satisfaction came when the prosecution played the audio recording of Marcus and Vivian discussing the timing of my theoretical death in relation to life insurance payout schedule. The casual cruelty in their voices, treating my murder as a logistics problem to be solved efficiently, visibly disturbed even the experienced federal judge presiding over the case. Several jurors looked physically sick as they listened to people planning a killing with the detached professionalism of accountants reviewing tax strategies. Marcus's testimony in his own defense was a disaster that his attorney clearly regretted allowing. His attempts to portray himself as a victim of Vivian's manipulation were undermined by the extensive email evidence showing his active participation in planning my death. His claims that he had never intended actual violence were contradicted by surveillance footage showing him positioning me at the cliff edge for a fatal push. His desperation was palpable as he realized that every word he spoke was digging his legal grave deep. The sentencing hearing provided the opportunity I had been waiting for since that night I first discovered their forged document. Victim impact statements in criminal cases are typically brief, but the judge allowed me extended time to address the court about the psychological toll of living with people planning my murder. My statement was carefully crafted to ensure that each defendant understood the personal cost of their betrayal while emphasizing the broader implications of their crimes for public trust in marriage and family relationships. Marcus received a sentence of life without parole for conspiracy to commit murder, with additional consecutive sentences for fraud, forgery, and racketeering. The judge specifically noted that the premeditated nature of his crimes and his abuse of marital trust warranted the harshest possible punishment. As the bailiff led him away in shackles, he made eye contact with me one final time, and I saw nothing but empty defeat in the eyes that had once convinced me of his love. Vivian's sentence of 35 years reflected both her role as the scheme's architect and her extensive criminal history. The federal prosecutor had worked with authorities in other states to ensure that her convictions would prevent any possibility of future parole, effectively guaranteeing that she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Her sophisticated knowledge of financial crime had made her dangerous, but that same sophistication had also created the evidence trail that ensured her complete destruction. Diana received 15 years for her role in the conspiracy, along with permanent disbarment from healthcare practice and substantial financial penalty. Tyler's sentence of 20 years included provisions for asset forfeiture that would strip him of any property obtained through his criminal activity. Helen, despite her age, received 10 years in federal prison, a sentence the judge described as necessary to deter other family members from participating in inheritance fraud scheme. The civil litigation that followed the criminal convictions provided additional satisfaction, as my wrongful death lawsuit against Marcus's estate proceeded, even though I had obviously survived their murder attempt. Oregon law allowed for damages based on the attempt itself, and the comprehensive evidence of their planning made the case straightforward. The judgment I obtained effectively transferred all of Marcus's remaining assets to my control, a fitting conclusion to his scheme to steal my property. The personal transformation that resulted from surviving this ordeal was profound in ways I hadn't anticipated. The experience of being targeted for murder by people I trusted had initially left me suspicious of everyone and everything, but gradually it evolved into a deeper appreciation for genuine relationships and authentic people. The colleagues who had supported me throughout the investigation, the law enforcement professionals who had protected me during the confrontation, And the friends who had stood by me during the media circus all proved themselves worthy of trust in ways that Marcus never had. My law practice flourished in the aftermath of the case as my reputation for detecting and prosecuting fraud attracted clients from across the Pacific Northwest. The publicity surrounding the trial had transformed me into something of a celebrity in legal circles, with speaking engagements at conferences and law schools providing opportunities to share my expertise in estate planning security. The irony was perfect. Marcus's attempt to destroy my career had instead elevated it to national prominence. The Rodriguez and Kim Associates partnership had weathered the storm beautifully, with David proving himself to be exactly the kind of reliable colleague that Marcus had pretended to be. Our client base expanded dramatically as word spread about our firm's expertise in protecting estates from internal threats, and we developed specialized services for detecting beneficiary fraud and asset manipulation. The business success I achieved in the years following the trial far exceeded anything I had accomplished during my marriage. Romance eventually returned to my life, though I approached new relationships with a healthy skepticism earned through bitter experience. The man I ultimately married was a federal prosecutor who had worked on the case against Marcus and his conspirators, someone whose understanding of criminal psychology made him uniquely qualified to appreciate both my vulnerability and my strength. Our relationship developed slowly and transparently, with none of the hidden agendas that had characterized my marriage to Marcus. The cabin in Bend was sold immediately after the trial, as I had no desire to return to the place where Marcus had attempted my murder. The proceeds were donated to a foundation supporting domestic violence survivors, providing a positive legacy for a location that had been intended as the site of my death. I purchased a new vacation home on the Oregon coast, where the sound of waves replaced the mountain silence that now held too many dark memories. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from Marcus in federal prison, his first communication since his sentencing. The letter was a rambling attempt at explanation and apology, claiming that he had been driven to desperation by financial pressures and Vivian's manipulation. He expressed regret for his actions and asked if I might consider visiting him to discuss reconciliation and forgiveness. My response was brief and definitive. I forwarded the letter to federal prosecutors as evidence of continued attempts to manipulate his victim. The anniversary of that confrontation on the mountain overlook has become a personal holiday of sorts, a day when I reflect on the transformation from potential victim to empowered survivor. Each year I hike a different trail in the Cascades, celebrating not just my survival but my victory over people who had seriously underestimated their intended target. The mountains that Marcus had chosen as the setting for my death became symbols of my resilience and strength. The legal reforms that resulted from the case provided lasting protection for future potential victims. Oregon's legislature passed comprehensive legislation requiring additional verification procedures for will changes and beneficiary modifications, making it much more difficult for criminals to forge estate planning documents. The Catherine Rodriguez Act established protocols for detecting inheritance fraud that have been adopted by legal professionals throughout the region. Looking back on the entire experience, what strikes me most is how Marcus and his conspirators created their own destruction through their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. They saw a successful woman and assumed she was vulnerable to manipulation. They observed a loving wife and concluded she was naive about deception. They targeted an estate planning attorney and somehow convinced themselves that she wouldn't recognize estate planning fraud. Their arrogance was matched only by their incompetence, but it was the combination of both qualities that made their complete defeat inevitable. They had chosen to commit sophisticated crimes against someone uniquely qualified to detect and prosecute exactly those types of offenses. The trap they thought they were setting for me became the mechanism of their own destruction, and their moment of intended triumph became the catalyst for their complete downfall. The scared woman who had first noticed suspicious credit card charges was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required fighting back with every weapon at your disposal. Marcus and his family had tried to make me disappear, but instead they had forged me into something stronger and more determined than I had ever been before. In attempting to destroy me, they had inadvertently created their most formidable opponent. The game they thought they were winning had been over before it truly began. decided not by their criminal planning but by their fatal decision to target someone who refused to be anyone's victim. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.